Hello, folks. Nicholas Medovich here with Strasbourg 1991 Productions, and I'm doing a re-upload. I'm doing a remake of an old upload that I actually had uploaded months ago. But since I didn't have the time to do it because of my schedule, everything was pretty much on hold. One of the few things I like about doing another book haul is looking at your top three picks of what emphasizes the nature of all walks of life, and what is your favorite what is your favorite topic? Studying accidents or locomotives or barbecue in any way would help out. You can actually order your paperbacks online. They're they're a little below $30, which are actually in very decent condition, which is even more better. And some of these paperbacks that I have are extremely unique. I've had them for years. But without further ado, I will bring you one of my favorite books. And this book is called A Ramble into the Past by Lee E. Rainey and Frank Kuiper. Frank was a historian for the East Broad Top back in the heyday during the 1970s and 60s, when East Broad Top actually originated from a coal operating railroad back in 1872 and 1873 and up to 1874, where they moved coal from the coal mines in north central Pennsylvania and Mount Union, the northern terminus, where it actually intersected with the Pennsylvania Standard Gauge Railroad, which standard gauge is rails that are 4 feet 8.5 inches apart compared to narrow gauge 3 feet apart, or 36 inches. One of the few factors is East Broad Top was one of the rarer dual gauge operations east of the Mississippi River in the world today. The other railroad, which actually did not survive a lot of their locomotives, was the Eastern Tennessee and Western North Carolina, which actually ran between those two states and was another coal hauling railroad for dual gauge operations. Both standard gauge and narrow gauge locomotives operated in that section where coal country and coal was very common in those parts of East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, between Asheville and Knoxville specifically. Some of the things I like about this book, and I give this an 8 out of 10 because it gives you good dialogue, but the only thing that gets me a little disappointed is it doesn't give you the exact specifics or the consistent specifics of what this railroad does. However, what I do love about this, if you look carefully in one of the pages, it actually will give you a give you the mile markers and mileposts on actually what locations are at the milepost. If you actually start at Mount Union, which is actually at the bottom section, which is like the northern terminus, and go down to Alvin, the new Alvin, which is currently the southern terminus, where the actual operations would end in Robertsdale and then on to Alvin, because the coal mines at the time back in the pre-1920s were booming back in the heyday at the turn of the century. They also had a collection of locomotives, and even sometimes they have rolling stock. And it will actually give you the history of each steam locomotive, from 262 Prairies to 282 Mikados, and other locomotives like 10-wheelers, moguls, and consolidations were very common on the East Broad Top Railroad back in the 1890s and 1880s, specifically. One of the few hot spots that I plan on doing is going to Rock Hill Furnace / Orbisonia, and there's a little bit of a history. Orbisonia is actually on the far banks of Black Log Creek compared to Rock Hill Furnace, which was the actual townhouse where the depot at Orbisonia Depot was actually located at Rock Hill Furnace. Orbisonia was actually across Black Log Creek over the trestle and on into State Route 522 crossing on and over to McMullen and Douglas Summits, which are other hotspots on the trip to Colgate Grove, which is home to a clay pit, and there's a wide track to turn the locomotive around, complete with the picnic pavilion. That project of reviving the Colgate Grove was actually completed. There's another branch line down to Saltillo, which is being worked on right now. And I heard they are getting very close to actually getting steam down to Saltillo once they restore their locomotives and their passenger equipment and their replicas. The railroad should be back in service later on. So definitely get one of these paperbacks in decent condition. It's one of the cheapest books you'd find. I give it a 10 out of 10 for a price. 8.2 out of 10 because there's not a consistent dialogue with this book, although it does give you actual history and information on the locomotives that were used at the turn of the century. The second book, which was actually the opposite of price, this one is called Slim Gauge Survivor. As you can see, these are the superheated Mikado locomotives, 16 and 17, approaching the Y track near Robertsdale, which is the coal hauling operation. And this book also has some very interesting value in this as the first one that I mentioned. It actually features, if you look here, the coal mines outside of Robertsdale and up to Mount Union, where some of the Mikados would actually have the narrow gauge, the standard gauge freight cars put on in narrow gauge trucks. Because this was a dual gauge operation, that they would actually put the standard gauge car bodies on narrow gauge trucks because it connected in an intersection with the Pennsylvania Railroad. And there was actually a tourist operation for dual gauge for the standard gauge that actually went up to Lucy's Furnace, which is north of Mount Union. And Mount Union is between the Pittsburgh and Harrisburg extension through the Pennsylvania-New Jersey Turnpike. One of the factors I found about Mount Union was one of the coal hauling railroads would actually haul more coal to those mines, and there would be the southern excursion trips down to Woodvale and Alvin. Now, in that area of operation, there are two tunnels at Seidling and Race Hill tunnels near Coles and Kimmel summits, and north of Shirleysburg was actually the town of Ogwick Mills and Ogwick's Creek. Ogwick Summit was actually home to the Tuscarora Valley pumping station, where the culverts were actually drained from the oil that was produced out of the Tuscarora Valley. The tunnels were actually located off the branch from Neelington, which is right across from Tuscarora Tunnel on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And there's also a saying that you should not cross center lines. Accidents are extremely common in portions of the tunnel and even in the portals of the tunnel. And even the railroads were left vulnerable, how they would actually move derelict equipment over the tunnel. Well, there was actually one time a grade that would go over the tunnel and would be on one side of the actual highway, interestingly enough. But if you were to look at the whole map of the operations from Mount Union to Alvin, this book would definitely be your recommendation. Although I would definitely recommend not buying this book. The only thing I have a 7.2 out of 10 on this is the price, which is not to me something you would look at. Not really consistent, but the dialogue, definitely an 18 star, no pun intended, because it gives you every dialogue of every steam locomotive and every part of the operation that this book contains. The last book was something that I had a copy that fell apart, called Trainwrecks by Robert C. Reed, who was an author, and he was on Trains Unlimited Great Train Disasters from 1997. The emphasis of this book is to really illustrate the trials and errors of train travel, from snakeheads, which occurred when strap rail was loosely fitted on wooden planks, to tampering with safety devices like safety valves on the Best Friend of Charleston back in 1831, and your crown sheet out in the open, which is the ultimate problem to steam locomotive safety. Boilers can build up so much heat, and because they're under pressure, if the water were to go below the crown sheet, the locomotive's boiler would explode, or a backdraft, which the crown sheet portion of the firebox would permanently collapse. There are also some books of boiler explosions, crossing accidents, derailments, collisions, bridge disasters, like in Angola, New York, Ashtabula, Ohio, and so many others. I definitely recommend this book. This is a 12 out of 10 for me. This is definitely very nonstop, action-packed adrenaline. And this is definitely a book I would recommend for all people who are interested in railroads and history of railroad tragedies and accidents. This is the book right here up to the 1950s. So definitely look at this and definitely look into this. This is a definite yes for any rail buff out there. Again, this is just my personal opinion on those 3 books, but you can also have a different opinion, but this is just my personal opinion. You don't have to take my word for it, but I appreciate the courage and compassion of what railroads and other topics do with people's motivation, their elegance, their excitement, how they emphasize the importance of fitting in with a chapter not associated with the railroads, but also with Roanoke as well. Until then, this is Nicholas Matovich speaking. Out.